Hello, and thank you for joining this webinar, which is brought to you by AIA Contract Documents. In this webinar, we're going to be talking about a trend that is becoming more common in the profession of architecture, and that is to have the architectural services on a project split between two different architects. And of course, because all the folks on this webinar, including myself, are affiliated with the AIA Contract Documents program, we're going to be talking about legal issues, contractual issues, risks that often come along with such two architect scenarios. Before I go any further, I have to give a few disclaimers. First of all, please do not copy this presentation without permission from the AIA Contract Documents program. Probably our most important disclaimer is that nothing that we say in this webinar should be considered as legal advice. The panelists who are going to be joining me are going to be talking about their own experiences with these issues, and we'll certainly refer to standard form contract language pretty consistently throughout this presentation. However, if you have an issue pertaining to one of your projects, we highly recommend that you consult with an attorney in your jurisdiction who can help you out with your specific needs. So most of the things that we're going to be talking about in this webinar are related to a new set of standard form documents that are published by the AIA Contract Documents program. These documents, all the ones that you're seeing on your screen right now, were published in the spring of this year. You can see the full names here that I'm not going to repeat, but they include a new owner design architect agreement, that's our B111, an owner architect of record agreement, that's a B112, and a few exhibits that can be attached to those agreements. And we'll certainly be talking about how these exhibits can be arranged and when they are appropriate to use in what scenarios during this webinar. We've also published a guide called the B511 Guide to Projects Involving a Design Architect and Architect of Record. This guide addresses a whole host of practical issues that tend to crop up when two architects perform services on a project. Before I go any further, I'm going to introduce myself, and I'm going to turn it over to my fellow panelists, Tracy, Tara, and Wolf, to introduce themselves. My name is Mike Koger. I'm an attorney with the AIA Contract Documents program. I've worked with the AIA Contract Documents for the past 9 years. Before that, I was in private practice as an attorney doing construction defect litigation. And even before that, I started my career actually as an architect. So I had a handful of years doing architecture work before becoming an attorney. So I'm now going to turn it over to Tracy. Tracy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hello, everyone. Tracy Lee with SQ Dumas Ripple. We're a 50-person architecture firm located in New Orleans. I've been a volunteer member of the AIA Documents Committee for 7 years now, and I was the chair of the group that drafted these documents that we're going to be talking about today. I think the topics, the issues that we're going to be addressing are really relevant in contemporary practice. If you think about it, there's really been a trend throughout the entire AEC, architecture, engineering, and construction community toward more collaboration, and that's resulted in things like alternative delivery methods like collaborative construction management, progressive design build, design assist, things like that. So I think it's a really great thing that AIA is paying attention to those trends and trying to contemporize the documents to stay in step with what's going on in the profession.
Thank you, Tracy. Tara, you want to tell us about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. So I'm Tara Myers, and I'm an architect and principal with Earl Swenson Associates in Nashville, Tennessee, and this is my 6th year serving on the AIA Documents Committee. And so in our firm at ESA, we do work across the U.S. in several sectors, including healthcare and hospitality, commercial office, higher ed. We have about 190 people, so we're not a small firm, but we're also not one of the big firms. And our size combined with our experience has led us to have a lot of partnerships with other architecture firms across the country. And we have been fortunate enough to serve in both roles as both the architect of record and the design architect. And so for the most part, these relationships have been really good, but at one point or another, they have all had their share of bumps and challenges along the way. And so I was really excited when the AIA brought this to our task group and said, hey, we want you guys to work on this new set of documents. And we're focused on making these relationships easier for both architects and owners and helping them navigate through that. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone here today to share some of the things we learned throughout that process.
Thank you, Tara. And Wolf, how about yourself?
Hi, I'm Wolf Saar. I'm the managing principal for VIA, a Perkins Eastman studio in, we have offices in Seattle, Vancouver, British Columbia, and Oakland. I happen to be speaking to you from Seattle, where I'm based. Our firm, like Tara's and Tracy's, has been involved in various projects, from multifamily to healthcare. For various reasons, we've collaborated on those projects. So I too was very excited to be invited to be part of this task group, because it's something that is near and dear to my heart, the idea of collaboration. So I've served 11 years on the documents committee. I am a former chair of the committee, and I served on this task group actually a little bit beyond my tenure on the documents committee, because it's just something that I really enjoyed developing with this group. Thank you.
I think it's because we keep asking you to come back, Wolf.
Yeah, before we start the discussion, I wanted to just set the table by talking just very briefly about process. The Contract Documents program is one of the most valuable things that AIA offers, not just to its membership, but also to everyone in the AEC space. Non-member architects, engineers, contractors, owners, developers. It's the documents program is really the gold standard, and AIA invests a lot of time and energy into trying to keep it that way. Next slide, please. Next, please. Thank you. The committee itself is made up of, back one, please. The committee itself is made up of about 30 practicing architects, all AIA members. And the attempt is to create a group with a really broad demographic. As you can see, there's geographic dispersion, people from all over the country. All of us are licensed architects and in professional practice, but some of us, a few people on the committee are attorneys as well as architects, as Mike is. There are, in addition to practicing architects, there are architects who are owners' representatives, people who work for contractors. There are some people who are risk management professionals, and also type of practice and size. There's a broad range there. There are some sole practitioners in the group. There are small firms that do residential work, medium-sized firms like mine at 50 people, ranging up to representatives from some of the largest architecture firms in the country, whose names you would recognize immediately. Next slide, please. The way the work is done within the committee is we are asked to divide ourselves or break up into smaller task groups of about 6, 7, 8 people, something like that. And each task group is given a task or a document to examine and analyze, and then present the resultant findings back to the full committee for debate and discussion, and eventually for a vote for approval. And the attempt there is to try to bring as many different voices and perspectives into the discussion as possible. In the case of the task group that we worked on together, the 4 of us, the challenge we were given was to analyze the condition where more than one architect works, where 2 architects work for the same client on the same project simultaneously. And that investigation resulted in a lot of different possibilities and permutations of that business arrangement, and we'll get into some of those in detail during this discussion. And we pretty quickly discovered that in certain scenarios that we'll talk about today, the documents program, AIA Documents program, already kind of had a solution built in. But the one hole that we found that there didn't seem to be a clear set of agreements for was the situation where there are two architects on the same project and each of them works independently directly for the same client. And that turns out to be more common than you might think that happens. Next slide, please. So what are the circumstances under which this might take place where there are two architects working in parallel? Well, in some cases, maybe the client wants complementary skills and maybe one of the architects has a certain specialty that they have a deep portfolio in that they can bring to the mix. Maybe there's a desire or a mandate to have an involvement from a minority representation, disadvantaged business, something like that. In another case, it may be about marketing on the ownership side. Maybe the owner or client wants a certain architect's name and brand associated with their project for fundraising purposes, but they realize the name brand design firm might not be interested in or willing to or even able to carry the project out through completion. So blending those skills helps to fill that gap. A strong reason for doing this is having a local representative. Sometimes in the similar situation that I just mentioned where there's a design architect, there may be the desire to have a local architect of record who understands the permitting process and can provide day-to-day field services during construction. Sometimes it's about bandwidth and capacity. Maybe it's possible to do the project more efficiently if two architects are working on it at the same time. Maybe one of the architects has a pre-existing relationship with the client but feels like they need more horsepower to get the project done if it's larger than one that they're accustomed to. And then sometimes the impetus for this comes from the architect's side. The team may find that it presents a stronger set of possibilities for being selected for the project, for winning the commission, if they market themselves as a comprehensive team, maybe with a local component if that's something that would appeal to a client, or with the blend of skills and specialization that might be a winning team to get the project. So those are some of the possibilities that we looked at as a group when we were putting this effort together. And with that, I'll send it back to Mike to start the discussion.
Thanks, Tracy. It was good background. I'm going to now turn it over to Tara, actually, and Tara is going to cover our first core topic, which is how are contracts structured on projects involving two architects. And Tara, I was a little bit personally surprised to find that there was not one consistent path that how people chose to organize their contracts. We found that people kind of tended to follow their own paths, and there's no overwhelming consistency, which was a surprise to me. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, Mike. And you're going to put up the next slide there. And I think we studied this in depth, actually, as we started into this process, and we interviewed a lot of architects outside of the committee and different firms that were doing this and working with other architects. And so we really kind of boiled this down into three common typologies for how this works. And the first one you see on the screen there is maybe one of the most common arrangements, is where the owner hires one architect and they enter into a prime agreement, and then that architect enters into a separate consultant agreement with the other architect. And our firm has used this type of arrangement when we were the architect of record and the owner wanted a single point of responsibility for the design team, and they didn't want to have to worry about scope gaps between the two design firms. And so in those situations, we negotiated the contract with the owner, hopefully using one of our AIA agreements, such as the B103, and we accepted full responsibility for the design. Then we turned around and we allocated portions of that responsibility to the design architect and all of our other consultants using AIA C401 architect consultant agreements. And so we've also been involved with this type of arrangement when the owner hired another firm as the architect of record, and we were brought in under that architect either as a specialty consultant or as the local architect to perform more of the what I'll call hometown services, such as zoning research, planning entitlements, or on-site representation during construction. And in both of those situations, collaboration and division of the services has been more streamlined when we have had a direct contract with the other architect. So the second scenario that you see in the center of the screen is one where really what we focused on with these new agreements, the B111 and the B112. And that's where each of the architects holds a separate prime agreement with the owner for their services. Now, we found during our interviews and discussions that owners may choose to go this path for a variety of reasons. One may being that they are bringing on the design architect early and they haven't yet identified the architect of record, or maybe they prefer to have direct control over, both of the contractual control over both of the architects. And really, we felt that the primary benefit for the architects in this situation is that neither architect has to take on responsibility or the liability of the other firm. As our firm at ESA, we've been involved on a few projects that followed this format, and we're not always at the table when the other architect negotiated their agreement, and therefore it became the owner's responsibility to help ensure that the scope of services for each of the architects was coordinated to avoid those scope gaps or overlaps. On some of the projects, our firm was the architect of record, and we were hired at the same time as the design architect. And this was really beneficial, but at the same time, it was very intensive as we would have a lot of meetings, and we developed extensive charts and matrices to define the scope and the role of each firm. And so it was our thought process that this new AIA B111 owner design architect and the B112 owner architect of record agreements were developed to assist the owners and architects in coordinating the services of the two architects and facilitating this as a smoother process. And then we have the third thing that you see on the screen, which is the joint venture. And honestly, our firm has never done one of these, and I think probably you'll find that this structure might be the least prevalent of these scenarios, as the two firms are required to form a separate legal entity that's distinct from their other business interests, and they share in the responsibility for the profits, losses, and costs associated with the project. So our committee didn't really study this type of relationship as we went through this process. We were focused more on the first two types that you see here. But the AIA does have an agreement. The C101 was developed and updated in 2018, which is an agreement for architects to use to form a joint venture partnership on a project. And then once they enter into that joint venture partnership, they can then contract directly with the owner using a standard owner-architect agreement, such as the B101 or the B103.
Thank you, Tara. I've got a follow-up question for you. Kind of setting aside the joint venture agreement for a second, because that is definitely a different way in which, these kind of two architect projects can be carried out by setting up a separate legal entity. I'm curious as to whether or not you have, your firm actually has like a preference between being, in a single prime scenario or a two prime. I'm looking at that diagram on the left of the screen, this prime scenario, and I'm thinking, I can imagine that would be either cause some conflicts with two architects, one having to work as a consultant, or maybe it would be better to kind of cut the owner somewhat out of the kind of minutia of coordinating things. Do you have a preference, or have you noticed either one of those is easier?
Well, I don't know. I think they both come with their own benefits and challenges. I will say, as our risk manager of the firm, I probably prefer option number 2, where we have separate agreements. And this is solely from the perspective that we don't carry the liability of the other architect under our agreement. Or in the case of where we're the design architect and the architect of record is negotiating the agreement, we have the opportunity to be at the table directly with the owner to negotiate that contract. So I would say, although we do a lot of option number 1, I'd probably prefer option number 2 from a legal and liability standpoint.
Well, that's a good point, that if you're in option number 1 with a single prime, the first architect, is kind of taking on responsibility for the second architect's, work in some ways as far as the coordination effort. And Wolf, what about you or Tracy? Do you have any preference as to either one of these structures?
I think Tracy has a comment.
Yeah, Mike, I just wanted to comment that when we went into this process, the analysis that preceded the actual drafting of the documents, I think just about all of us thought that the first scenario was really predominant. And I was personally a little surprised to find how common the second one is, where each architect is contracted directly to the client. And I think if I had to conjecture about that, I would repeat what Tara said, which is that in some cases, the client may want to have more control or more transparency about what happens in the process between the two architects. And that would be the reason for contracting individually with each of them.
Yeah, we worked on it for the same client, first with one project where the client brought a design architect, actually had a relationship with the design architect that did not belong to a large firm. It was just an individual. So that client contracted with the design architect and then with us separately. And so the design architect had their responsibility to produce a design. We had the responsibility of AOR, and we went through something similar to the responsibility matrix, the E205 that we're going to talk about here. That actually worked better than the second project, where we were the sole prime and had that same design architect as our consultant, and actually ended up resulting in some finger pointing and such down the road when a couple of things didn't turn out the way that the client had expected. It's interesting because I would think that the collaborative one would work best, but I think these documents are really a way that if we had that, we would have avoided a lot of the issues that we encountered on that second project.
Agree with that. We looked very closely at the C401 agreement, which is traditionally used by architects, between architects and their engineering consultants, and we examined that to see if it really worked for the architect scenario, and we found that it did. It required some modification, and Wolf mentioned the responsibility matrix. That's really a common thread that we found for almost all the architects doing this kind of collaborative work, was that there was some kind of document or matrix or spreadsheet or something that attempted to allocate the responsibilities between the two architects before the project began, which really takes a lot of experience and guesswork.
Well, Tracy, that's an excellent segue into our next topic, which is how do two architects allocate design responsibilities between themselves on a project? Because you can see, even though obviously in the two prime scenario here, each architect has an independent contract with the owner, there's going to be a heavy amount of parsing out who does what in either of these scenarios. So Wolf, can I leave it to you to kick us off on the different ways that you can allocate design responsibilities?
Can you bring up the next slide, please?
Very good.
I think that will help us, at least provide us with a graphic. These graphics actually were produced by one of our colleagues, Guy Maxwell, who's with Eniod Architects in New York, and he also participated in this task group. And early on, he started sketching the relationship diagrams. So we thought these would be very helpful in talking about this. So the first diagram, the one that at the top, really is the one that shows a concurrent relationship. This is where the design architect and the architect of record truly collaborate on the project. Design architect has, both are retained right at the beginning of the project, rather than that scenario that I'm going to talk about soon about consecutive. So both are at the table at the beginning. Both are coordinating each other, with each other on their services. So early in the project, the design architect has really the primary responsibility. But the AOR is there to provide some consulting and provide input along the way. and also really become familiar with the design and what's behind the design that the design architect is developing. And then as the project progresses, the architect of record gradually takes on more responsibility for construction documentation and for the construction phase, with the design architect in a consulting role. And this is really a good thing, because that way the design architect still is there when a question pops up in construction. If there's something about a submittal or a substitution, that design architect may be able to weigh in on that and keep true to that original design concept. So we developed that E205 responsibility matrix, and that's a really great roadmap for guiding the two entities in terms of who does what down the road. In our firm, and our firm, just as background, was called Via Architecture, and then middle of last year we merged with Perkins Eastman. So this is prior to the merger. We were involved in a lot of projects that utilize that collaborative approach. We always prided ourselves in being collaborators. We do a lot of transit work where we collaborate with engineers of record, and we are the design architect and essentially the AOR as well for the architecture. But it does require a great deal of upfront communication. And candidly, before these documents were published, it was somewhat of a struggle for us. And it was always a reinvention each time we encountered this type of arrangement. And so the responsibility matrix really provides an excellent and comprehensive template to guide those discussions. Even if you don't use the AIA documents, that responsibility matrix is really a helpful document. On the lower part of the slide is the consecutive model. I think this one is really, it's a hard transfer with a package of documents and information to convey the design that the design architect creates, and just convey that, transfer it over to the architect of record, and the architect of record says, bye-bye design architect, we're moving on, and continues through the end. But as we discussed it, and as we developed the exhibits to the B111 and B112, those exhibits start to define a little in a finer grain that relationship. And one of the key elements that we brought in was the requirement for the architect of record to review and evaluate the design architect's transfer package, to basically understand what's there. We have been involved in the transfer package scenario on multifamily projects here in Seattle, and have often been, the owner says, okay, I've got a design architect, then they're going to do a transfer package, they're going to hand it over to you, but there's no discussion with the design architect. There's no real opportunity to review that transfer package before we have provided a proposal. And it's created a lot of kind of going back and saying, hey, we expected to get this, we expected to have a working BIM model, or whatever the issue is. This review element is really important in these where you transfer the responsibility. And the other key element that we introduced was a meeting, and that's a meeting between the design architect, the AOR, the owner, to review and discuss and have an exchange at that point. So we think that's a really important element, having been in situations where we really didn't have much contact with the design architect at all. There's one more approach, and that's one where there are separate scopes for both architects. This is where, for instance, where I've seen it mostly is in the core and shell and TI model. So if you're doing an office building, one architect does the core and shell, the other one does all the interiors, the lobbies, the tenant improvement spaces, and that's more of a standard. That one really lends itself rather well to the cutoff, and in those cases there isn't a transfer package. There's just the documents that the first architect creates and the second architect picks up to do their work within that core and shell. So the B103 or maybe even the B101 might be applicable in those cases. Back to you.
Well, got a follow-up question for you. And
Sure.
I can definitely think of practical scenarios. In fact, I've been involved with a few projects where you had the hard transfer of responsibility, where it was just kind of a necessity that you couldn't, that one architect was hired first, got part of the way through design. It was kind of recognized that they couldn't finish the project, and so you had to do a hard transfer. So there's definitely some practical reasons why you would have a structure like that. We didn't ever say it in our documents or even in our guide that the concurrent services that are shown at the top with a responsibility matrix where both architects start at the same time and have overlapping services. We never said that that was kind of the best practices way to do a project like this, but it sure seems like after, talking with enough architects over the last couple of years about this, that is the best practices way. Am I right about that? Is that a truth about you've learned about structuring projects with two architects?
I mean, like I said earlier, we're very embracing of collaboration. We think that through collaboration we can create better, projects. But there are circumstances where it really necessitates that hard transfer. I certainly like the clarity of that from a risk management point of view. But really, to truly collaborate, you really need to have the entities discussing right from the beginning. And for me, that's the ideal scenario. I think from our discussions with, interviewing architects, owners, during the process of developing this document, I think we believe that that's pretty much a commonly held feeling, that that's a good way to do it and is maybe the most common. That the consecutive model is a little less common. And, when we talk about some of the challenges and opportunities later on, that we can kind of delve into that, kind of following the same 5 items that Tracy talked about, why you would do it why you would collaborate. And maybe depending on the why, it can kind of lead you into whether you would go consecutive or concurrent.
Tara, I see you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to I guess, further that discussion about the model you see at the bottom there, which is the consecutive. And we had a lot of debate as a task group about where you draw that line in terms of, is it the end of design development? Is it the end of schematic design? And I think we came to the conclusion that it really can happen at different points in the project, but for the purposes of these documents, we had to come up with one scenario, and we chose that handoff would happen at the end of design development, just by giving the design architect the ability to design and detail the project up through design development and then hand it off at the construction document phase. But I think we realized, based on, I know in our firm and in others, that often happens at either SDs or 50% SDs. It happens maybe at another phase. And in that situation, you can take those documents and shift language from one to the other to actually accomplish that. I don't think that has to always happen as it's shown on the screen. I just wanted to be clear about that for some people who may be on the call today saying, wait a minute, this is not, why did you pick that point in time, or that's not how we do this.
Yeah, Tara, I was going to say something similar, slightly different inflection. You know, like your firm, ours has been on both sides of the table. We consider ourselves a design first firm, but we've also done quite a bit of AOR type work. And design doesn't end at design development. There's the act of constructing the details, thinking through the project, and putting together the CD package sometimes involves, at the detail level, almost always involves some element of design. And although it's a bad habit to do design work during construction phase, sometimes the decisions you make in the field are really design related decisions. So the idea of having the blend of responsibilities, the kind of concurrent structure, just seems to maintain involvement if it can be done in a collaborative way.
Absolutely. So speaking of the collaboration, I'm going to move on to our first optional topic, which is coordination of how do the two architects coordinate. One side note, I should say, we're obviously not going to get to all of the topics that we would love to on this program. Definitely take a look at the guide that we mentioned earlier, the B511. We tackled some very interesting issues that we won't have time for, such as, does the design architect have to be licensed? The short answer to that is you need to look at the way architecture and the practice of architecture is defined in your particular jurisdiction. Quite often, jurisdictions will define the practice of architecture very broadly, so it's entirely possible to be doing schematic design and handing off the responsibility to another architect and still be effectively practicing architecture in your state. So take a look at the guide, but also take a look at your state's, your jurisdiction's rules on the practice of architecture. So Tara, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about coordination responsibilities between two architects. I think we're going to show some slides on like what the language that we came up with, but the language that's in the contracts is kind of surface level in my mind, but the actual coordination that happens goes way deeper. Go right ahead.
Great. Well, while you're pulling that up, I'll dive in here. So I think most of us are accustomed to, we've got a standard arrangement where the owner hires an architect and that architect then hires the consultants to work under it. In those situations, the owner is expecting to receive a coordinated set of documents from the design team. When you have two architects where one works directly for the owner and the other architect works under that first architect as a consultant, the two architects are expected to deliver a cohesive design to the owner, similar to the expectations for the architect and any of its other consultants. And how they accomplish that is really left up to the discretion of the architects. But in the end goal, it's, the goal is for their services to be coordinated. So in the case of where you have multiple prime agreements where both architects work directly for the owner, the end goal is the same, but really the situation to get you there is a little more complicated. And it's complicated by the fact that the architects are not contractually tied to one another. And this can put the owner in the middle of a situation that they aren't prepared to navigate. So in the AIA B111 and the B112, we wanted to put together language that we could use to help provide the owner and architect's direction in those situations. And these agreements both provide that neither architect has sole responsibility for coordination. The language you're seeing there is from the Architect of Record Agreement, but the language in the Design Architect Agreement is very similar, and both architects have a duty to the owner to coordinate their services with those services provided by the owner and the owner's consultants. So Mike, if you could move on to the next slide. In addition, both of the agreements, the B111 and the B112, contain language similar to a standard B101 that states the owner has a duty or responsibility to coordinate the services of its consultants with each architect. So as both the design architect and the architect of record work for the owner is expected to help manage the relationships of all its consultants and make sure that they each know the other's scope of services. And if that includes, you're defining in those agreements what are the basic services and what might be additional services. And it includes making sure that as those things come up that are not in basic services along the path, that they are then either hiring new consultants on the team to take on those new services, or allocating those responsibilities to one of the architects that's already under contract. Last, Mike, if we can move on to the next slide. I think another thing that we talked about extensively on these committees is really the use of BIM. It seems like most of these relationships where you have a project and you have multiple architects tend to be more complicated or larger projects. And using the use of digital data and BIM is going to have to also be coordinated on those projects. So these agreements contain language similar to the B101, B103 that says the owner and the parties that are party to this agreement are going to agree on the protocols for these BIM and transferring data between the parties. And as the owner holds those contracts with each of the architects, if we're working in this 2-prime agreement, they are in a position to help confirm that these conversations are happening. But based on the complexities of BIM, it's probably going to be likely up to the architects to lead and or guide the process and make sure that they're coming to these agreements and the use and reliance of information. Because we all know that I think Wolf talked about it earlier, when you have these projects and especially if you have like a handoff in the project and you're not sure what you're getting from the other architect in terms of a model or what the level of detail is in something. So having these conversations and coordination responsibilities allocated to both architects and saying that they both have a responsibility to sit at the table and come up with these solutions is pretty important to the process.
Tara, a quick question about BIM and in projects where you worked with another architect, is it common to be sharing a BIM model back and forth pretty seamlessly, or is that something where you feel comfortable doing and writing up protocols around that, or is that something where people are kind of protecting their turf and they're a little bit more hesitant to do?
I think you're going to see that the full spectrum across the board in terms of that. And in our firm, we are comfortable sharing the model, but we are going to, put in place agreements and BIM protocol and making sure that everybody understands, how we're going to move forward with that process. I think there's also a hesitancy on some firms in terms of sharing models and all of their standard details and things they may have built into the model. So there may be confidentiality agreements or things that are tied to that sharing and use. But I know that in the case of our firm, we're actually doing some of the larger projects where we're using this kind of an arrangement. We're using BIM 360 and both architects are in the same model, working at the same time. And we've just developed protocols for what that's going to look like.
Yeah, that I have the same experience in practice. I will say that in the hard handoff, where we were not involved in the first part, I have yet to have a project where we didn't have an issue with the BIM model that we were handed by the design architect. And in all of the cases that I've been personally involved with, we've had to start from scratch and create our own BIM model. It's there. As a practical thing, not so much about reliance or of information. As a practical thing, it's very difficult to pick up somebody else's BIM model that you haven't had influence on and use it efficiently in as AOR.
It might be good to pause for a second and point out or discuss some of the reasoning behind the structure of these documents with the 2 agreements and then the 2 exhibits and then the standalone responsibility matrix. The structure of this, especially if each architect is contracted directly to the owner, really sets up an unusual dynamic because the 2 architects are not contractually obligated to each other, but they're reliant and dependent on each other to deliver a full set of services to their mutual client. So the reason for the 2 exhibits become a kind of a zero-sum game, by which I mean everything that is to be delivered in terms of services has to be contained somewhere within those 2 exhibits. And there's a way to calibrate between the 2, depending on responsibilities, as Tara pointed out. Sometimes that can happen earlier in the design phase, and that would require some adjustments to the two exhibits, but they really follow in lockstep. If something comes out of one, it has to go in the other. And the responsibility matrix is structured kind of the same way. There's a presumptive division of responsibilities in there, but it's pretty easy to adjust and manipulate that according to the project and the circumstances. It's just that the intent is that the entire scheme of services is captured, and there's an attempt to have as little overlap or duplication of responsibility as possible.
That's a good point, Tracy. I think, what Tara, the contract language we just looked at about the mutual coordination responsibilities is, and it's a real contractual responsibility, but it is very high level, right? Like, what does it mean to coordinate with another architect? I mean, the details of that you could just write endlessly on. But that's, to me, that's the biggest selling point for having a responsibility matrix that appropriately portions out, who's doing what. Or alternatively, if you're doing a hard transfer, to have the exhibits that very firmly have what is each person's responsibility, to help add a little bit of clarity to that coordination responsibility.
I completely agree, and that was a really thing we talked about a lot when we were creating the E205, which essentially, if you look at the E205, it's taking the scope of services from a B101 or B103, and it's laying them out and then giving you the opportunity to allocate those services to either the design architect or the architect of record, or say that, the combined, they're going to, share in this responsibility. And that's when I think it becomes really important to use the notes column in that agreement to say, okay, if we're going to share in this responsibility, then here is what that looks like. This is the piece of this that you're going to take on, and this is the piece of this that I'm going to take on. And that's where you can really more so kind of create your own environment within the E205 and really tailor it to meet the needs of your particular project.
And with that, unless anyone else has any other anything else to add, I'll go ahead and close this out.
I just make a quick plug for the guide. You talked about the B511. I think it's free and it's out there on AIA Contract Documents website, and it answers a lot of the questions maybe that we didn't get to today. So.
Absolutely, definitely. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.